I didn't know that stopping my car that night would tie my life to the most dangerous man in the city. The rain hammered against my windshield so hard it sounded like gravel, each drop exploding under the streetlights as I drove down Harbor Road a little after midnight. My fingers tight on the steering wheel of my aging Honda Civic, while the wipers struggled to keep up with the storm rolling in from the bay. I had just finished a 10-hour shift at a small urgent care clinic outside downtown Baltimore, and all I wanted was a hot shower and maybe 6 hours of sleep before doing it all again tomorrow. The roads were nearly empty, the kind of quiet that only shows up after midnight when the city finally exhales, and the yellow streetlights stretched across the wet pavement like broken reflections of another world. That was when I saw the black car. At first it looked like any other luxury sedan pulled halfway onto the shoulder, its headlights still glowing faintly through the rain. But something about the angle felt wrong, like it had stopped too suddenly. I slowed without thinking. My brain told me to keep driving. My hands turned the wheel anyway. The closer I got, the more I noticed the details. The driver's door hanging slightly open, the interior lights flickering dimly, the faint smell of smoke drifting through the rain-soaked air. Someone could be hurt, I whispered to myself, even though no one else was on that empty stretch of road to hear me. I pulled over about 20 feet ahead of the car and stepped out into the storm, the rain instantly soaking through my jacket as my sneakers splashed through shallow puddles. My heart was pounding harder than it should have been. It always does when something feels off. I reached the open door and leaned inside, expecting an empty seat or maybe someone conscious enough to answer me. Instead, I saw him. A tall man slumped across the passenger seat, dark hair damp against his forehead, his expensive suit jacket stained and wrinkled like the night had torn through it. His breathing was shallow but steady. Relief washed through me so quickly my knees almost buckled. "Hey," I said softly, touching his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" His eyes didn't open, but his hand moved slightly, instinctively searching for something to hold on to. The interior smelled like burned rubber and overheated metal, and somewhere under the hood a faint hiss told me the car wasn't going to stay quiet much longer. I didn't think about consequences. I didn't think about who he might be or why someone like him was alone on a road like this in the middle of a storm. I just grabbed his arm and pulled. He was heavier than he looked, easily over 6 feet tall and solid, and it took everything I had to guide him out of the car and across the wet asphalt until we reached the grass beside the road. The moment we collapsed against the muddy ground, a deep cracking sound echoed behind us, and the car released a cloud of smoke that disappeared into the rain. My heart pounded in my ears as I turned back to the stranger lying beside me. His face was pale but unmistakably strong, sharp jawline, dark lashes, the kind of features you only see in expensive magazines or movies about powerful men. As if sensing my stare, his eyes flickered open for half a second. They were the coldest shade of green the first had ever seen. His fingers tightened weakly around my wrist. His voice came out rough, barely louder than the rain. "You shouldn't have stopped." I had no idea then that the man I had just dragged out of that car was Adrian Cross, and saving him was about to change everything about my life. I tried to pull my hand away, but his grip held for another second before slowly loosening, like his strength had burned through the last of its fuel. The rain kept falling, steady and cold, soaking through my clothes until I could feel it running down my spine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The road was empty again, silent except for the storm and the soft ticking sound coming from the cooling engine behind us. I leaned closer to him, brushing wet hair away from his forehead so I could see his face clearly. "Stay with me," I said quietly, even though I had no idea who he was or why he had been alone out here. His eyes opened again, just barely, unfocused but aware enough to notice me. Up close they were even stranger, a pale green that seemed almost silver. Under the streetlight, he studied me like he was trying to memorize something important. "Did you call anyone?" he asked, his voice rough and slow. "Not yet," I admitted. "I was trying to get you out first." For a second something like frustration crossed his face, and he glanced toward the dark road, as if expecting something to appear through the rain. "You should leave," he murmured. "Now." The words were calm but urgent, the kind of tone that made my stomach tighten without understanding why. "I am not leaving you here," I replied. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket, my fingers shaking from the cold as I tried to unlock it. The screen lit up my face in the darkness. No signal. I stared at the corner of the screen in disbelief. Harbor Road ran along the edge of the water, and the reception had always been unreliable, but I had never noticed it until this moment. Great, I whispered under my breath. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked down at him again. His breathing had steadied slightly, though he still looked pale and exhausted. My car is right there, I said, pointing toward the Civic parked along the shoulder. I can drive you to the hospital. It is about 15 minutes from here. His gaze shifted toward my car, then back to me, and something complicated moved behind those pale eyes. Not fear. Something sharper. Calculation maybe. Hospital is not a good idea, he said slowly. I frowned. You were just in a car that nearly caught fire. The hospital is exactly the right idea. For a second I thought he might argue, but instead his eyes closed again like the effort of speaking had drained whatever strength he had left. The rain softened slightly, turning into a steady mist that blurred the streetlights and made the empty road feel even more distant from the rest of the world. I hesitated, staring down at this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and somehow turned my quiet drive home into something else entirely. Every sensible voice in my head told me to call for help and step back. But when I looked at him lying there in the wet grass, one thought kept returning. If I walked away now, he might not make it. Okay, I said softly, mostly to myself. I slid my arm under his shoulders again and tried to lift him carefully. He was heavier than before, or maybe I was just colder and more tired, but little by little we managed to stand. His arm draped across my shoulders as we took a few slow steps toward my car. Each step felt uncertain, like the night itself was holding its breath. When we finally reached the passenger door of my Civic, he paused long enough to glance at me again. His voice was quieter this time, almost thoughtful. You really should have kept driving. I gave a tired half smile as I helped him into the seat. Yeah, I said. I am starting to get that feeling. Neither of us realized that somewhere across the city, people were already searching for the man sitting in my passenger seat. The heater in my car rattled to life as I turned the key, filling the small cabin with a shaky hum that sounded far too fragile for the storm outside. Water dripped from our clothes onto the worn fabric seats while the windshield fogged almost instantly from the difference in temperature. I wiped a circle in the glass with my sleeve so I could see the road ahead. Harbor Road stretched out empty and dark, the yellow streetlights reflecting in long streaks across the wet pavement like melted gold. I shifted the car into drive and eased back onto the road, keeping one eye on the stranger slumped beside me. Adrian Cross. The name meant nothing to me yet, but something about him made the air inside the car feel heavier than before. He had not spoken again since climbing into the passenger seat. His head leaned back against the window, eyes closed, his breathing slow but uneven. Every few seconds his brow tightened, like he was forcing himself to stay conscious. I kept my speed just under 30 miles per hour because the rain was still coming down hard enough to blur the edges of everything beyond the headlights. Stay awake, I said gently, glancing toward him. We are almost halfway to the hospital. His eyes opened slightly at the word hospital, and that same flicker of resistance crossed his face again. No hospital, he repeated quietly. The way he said it was not dramatic or loud. It was calm, certain, like a rule he had lived by for a very long time. I exhaled slowly and tightened my grip on the steering wheel. You keep saying that, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But you are not exactly in a position to negotiate right now. For a moment, he looked like he might argue again, but instead his gaze shifted toward the dashboard, studying the cracked plastic of my 15-year-old car like it was the most interesting thing in the world. You drive this every day? He asked after a moment. The question caught me off guard. Yes, I said. It gets me where I need to go. He nodded faintly, as if that answer confirmed something in his mind. Outside the rain began to ease slightly, turning from a heavy downpour into a steady curtain of mist that drifted across the road. The silence between us stretched longer than I expected, broken only by the soft whir of the heater and the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. I could feel his attention on me even when he closed his eyes again, like he was measuring something he had not decided how to explain yet. After a few minutes he spoke again, his voice quieter now. What is your name? I hesitated for half a second before answering. Ella Monroe. He repeated it under his breath, testing the sound of it like a word from another language. Ella. Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain. I kept my eyes on the road, focusing on the faint glow of the hospital sign that was beginning to appear in the distance. Relief washed over me when I saw it. Just a few more minutes and professionals could take over whatever situation I had accidentally stepped into tonight. But before I could say anything else, Adrian suddenly straightened in his seat, his expression sharpening despite the exhaustion still written across his face. His eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "Slow down," he said quietly. The tone of his voice had changed completely. I glanced up at the mirror, expecting to see another car passing through the rain. Instead, I saw two distant headlights turning onto Harbor Road behind us, moving faster than any car should on a storm-soaked street. My stomach tightened as the lights grew brighter in the glass. "Do you know them?" I asked carefully. Adrian did not answer right away. His gaze stayed locked on the mirror, calm and calculating in a way that made my pulse start to rise. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but unmistakably serious. "Ella," he said slowly, "I need you to keep driving." The headlights in the rearview mirror grew brighter with every passing second, cutting through the mist like two sharp, white knives slicing across the dark road behind us. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as my heart began to beat faster than the rhythm of the windshield wipers. Harbor Road had always been quiet at this hour, the kind of place where a single car might pass every few minutes. Not a place where someone drove fast enough to close the distance this quickly during a storm. I kept my speed steady just above 30 miles per hour, trying to convince myself that whoever was behind us was just another late-night driver trying to get home. But Adrian was still watching the mirror, his posture straighter now despite the exhaustion that had nearly pulled him unconscious only minutes earlier. His pale green eyes looked sharper, focused in a way that made the small space inside my Civic suddenly feel much smaller. "Do not panic," he said quietly. The calm in his voice somehow made my nerves worse instead of better. "I am not panicking," I replied, though the way my fingers gripped the wheel probably said otherwise. The headlights behind us moved closer again, large and steady, the glow reflecting off the wet pavement like a second pair of moons chasing us down the road. I swallowed and tried to focus on the hospital sign glowing faintly about half a mile ahead. Just a little farther, and there would be lights, people, security cameras, someone who could take over this strange night that had started with a quiet drive home and somehow turned into something else entirely. "Maybe they are just going to pass us," I said, more to reassure myself than him. Adrian did not answer immediately. He studied the mirror for another long second before turning his gaze toward the road ahead. "Maybe," he said. His tone suggested he did not believe that at all. The rain had softened into a light mist now, but the pavement was still slick, and I could feel the tires slide slightly each time I adjusted the wheel. My Civic was not built for sudden maneuvers, and the thought crossed my mind that whoever was behind us was driving something much stronger. The headlights shifted slightly to the left side of the road, as if the driver was considering pulling alongside us. My pulse jumped. "They are getting closer," I said quietly. Adrian leaned forward just enough to look past the dashboard and toward the road ahead. The hospital sign was clearly visible now, glowing blue and white at the end of the long, straight stretch of asphalt. "Good," he murmured. I glanced at him. "Good." He nodded once. "Lights. Cameras. People." His breathing had grown steadier, though I could still see the strain in the way he held his shoulders. Whatever had happened to him before I found him on the side of the road had not fully released its grip yet. The headlights behind us suddenly surged closer again, the vehicle accelerating enough that I could feel the pressure of its presence almost like a physical weight behind my car. My stomach tightened. "They are not passing," I whispered. Adrian remained calm, his eyes shifting between the mirror and the glowing hospital entrance ahead. "Ella," he said, his voice low but firm, "when we reach those lights, pull into the front entrance and stop where everyone can see us." I nodded without hesitation. The hospital parking lot entrance appeared on the right side of the road, the bright overhead lamps illuminating the wet pavement like daylight. As I turned the wheel and guided the Civic toward the entrance, the headlights behind us slowed slightly, but did not disappear. For the first time since I had found him beside that broken car, Adrian allowed himself to lean back against the seat again. His eyes closed for a moment as the bright hospital lights washed over the windshield. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. I pulled the car to a stop directly beneath the main entrance canopy where the lights were strongest and the glass doors reflected our headlights back into the night. The engine hummed softly while I stared forward, waiting to see if the mysterious car would follow us into the parking lot or disappear back into the dark road behind us. I kept my hands on the steering wheel even after the car stopped. My fingers still tight around it like the road might suddenly disappear if I let go. The hospital entrance lights flooded the windshield with white glare, bright enough to make the rain outside look like silver threads drifting through the air. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The engine hummed softly beneath the dashboard while the windshield wipers continued their slow rhythm across the glass. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. The car that had been following us rolled past the hospital entrance without turning into the lot. Its headlights swept across the wet pavement and then disappeared down the road like nothing had happened. The tension in my chest loosened a little. "They are gone," I said quietly. Adrian did not answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the mirror for another moment before finally shifting toward the glass doors of the emergency entrance ahead of us. Nurses moved behind the bright lobby windows, silhouettes passing back and forth under fluorescent lights. The sight felt comforting in a way I had not expected. Normal. Safe. Real. "Good," he murmured. The word came out softer than before, like whatever strength had carried him through the last few minutes was finally fading. I turned in my seat to look at him fully for the first time since we arrived. The harsh hospital lights revealed details I had missed in the darkness of Harbor Road. His suit was expensive, the kind of fabric that held its shape even when soaked with rain. His watch alone probably cost more than my car. But the thing that held my attention was his expression. The sharp focus he had shown while watching the road was slipping away, replaced by exhaustion that seemed to settle deeper with every breath. "You need help," I said gently. "Real help. Not just someone driving you around in a 15-year-old Honda." For the first time since I found him, something almost like amusement touched his face. "Your car did the job," he said. His voice had grown quieter again. I reached for the door handle. "I'm going to get someone," I said. "Just stay here." Before I could open the door, his hand moved again and lightly caught my wrist. The touch was weaker this time, but deliberate. I looked back at him, surprised. His pale green eyes met mine with an intensity that made the bright hospital lights fade into the background. "Ella Monroe," he said slowly, repeating my name with careful clarity. Hearing my full name made me blink. "How did you?" I stopped. I had introduced myself earlier, but something about the way he said it felt different, like he was committing it to memory instead of simply repeating it. "Thank you," he said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than I expected. I shook my head slightly. "You do not need to thank me. Anyone would have stopped." Adrian studied me for a long moment, and the faintest trace of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "No," he said softly. "Not anyone." The sliding glass doors of the emergency entrance opened as a nurse stepped outside with a clipboard, scanning the parking area beneath the canopy. I gently slipped my wrist free and reached for the door again. "Stay awake," I told him. "I will be right back." I stepped out into the cool night air, the mist brushing across my face as I walked quickly toward the entrance. Behind me, the engine of my Civic continued to hum beneath the hospital lights. Inside that small car sat a man I had met less than 30 minutes ago, a stranger who somehow already felt like the center of a story I did not yet understand. I hurried through the sliding glass doors into the bright emergency lobby, the sudden warmth and fluorescent lights making the storm outside feel like a distant memory. The smell of disinfectant and coffee hung in the air, familiar and oddly comforting after the strange quiet of Harbor Road. A nurse at the front desk looked up from her computer as I approached, water dripping from the sleeves of my jacket onto the polished floor. "Excuse me," I said, trying to steady my voice. "There is someone in my car outside who needs help. He was in a crash, and he looks pretty bad." Her expression shifted instantly from routine focus to alert attention. "Is he conscious?" she asked as she stood up. "Barely," I answered, "but he is awake." She nodded and gestured toward a second nurse who had just stepped out from the hallway behind her. "Bring a wheelchair," she called quickly. The second nurse disappeared down the hall while the first one walked around the desk. Toward me. "Show me," she said. I turned and led her back outside beneath the entrance canopy where my Civic still idled beneath the bright overhead lights. The rain had slowed to a thin mist that shimmered in the glow from the hospital lamps. For a brief second, relief washed over me again. Everything was going to be fine now. We had reached the hospital. There were professionals here who knew what to do. The nurse stepped ahead of me and leaned down toward the passenger side window. "Sir," she said gently as she opened the door. "Can you hear me?" Adrian stirred slightly in the seat, his eyes opening halfway as the bright lights reached him again. For a moment, he looked confused, like he had forgotten where he was. Then his gaze shifted toward me standing beside the car, and something settled in his expression again. "Told you," he murmured quietly. "Hospital." I could not help smiling a little at that. "You are welcome," I replied softly. The nurse studied him carefully, already assessing the situation with calm efficiency. "We are going to bring you inside," she said, her tone professional but reassuring. Adrian looked at her, then at the hospital entrance, then finally back at me. Something unreadable passed through his eyes again. "No," he said. The nurse blinked in surprise. "Sir, you need medical attention." His voice was still quiet, but the certainty in it had returned. I said no hospital. I stared at him, confused. "Adrian, you cannot be serious," I said. "You were barely conscious 10 minutes ago." Hearing his name seemed to pull him fully back into focus. His eyes sharpened slightly as he looked from me to the nurse again. The nurse straightened, clearly used to stubborn patience, but not quite expecting this level of resistance. "If you were in an accident, you should at least come inside for evaluation," she insisted gently. Adrian slowly pushed himself upright in the seat, though the movement clearly cost him effort. He looked toward the hospital entrance again, then back at me. "Ella," he said quietly. The way he said my name made the nurse glance between us with curiosity. "I appreciate what you did tonight," he continued, his voice steady despite the strain behind it. "But I cannot go inside that building." The mist drifted across the parking lot while the three of us stood there beneath the bright canopy lights. I felt the strange weight of the moment pressing down on me again, the same feeling I had back on Harbor Road when he first told me I should have kept driving. "You almost passed out in my car," I said carefully. "And you still think walking away from a hospital is a good idea?" Adrian held my gaze for a long second before answering. "Yes," he said quietly, "because if I walk inside, a lot more people will know I am here." The nurse and I stood there for a moment beneath the hospital canopy, both staring at Adrian like we were waiting for him to explain something that made sense. The mist drifted across the parking lot, and the bright white lights reflected off the wet pavement, turning the ground into a mirror of scattered reflections. For the first time since I had pulled him from that broken car on Harbor Road, the strange calm in Adrian's voice made me feel uneasy instead of relieved. "What do you mean more people will know you are here?" I asked quietly. The nurse crossed her arms slightly, still professional but clearly concerned. "Sir, hospitals do not broadcast patient information," she said. "Your privacy would be protected." Adrian gave a faint shake of his head, like she had misunderstood something much larger than hospital policy. His pale green eyes moved slowly across the parking lot, studying the empty spaces beyond the entrance as if he expected something to appear out of the darkness. "It is not the hospital I am worried about," he said. The nurse looked at me briefly, silently asking if I knew what he meant. I shook my head. I did not understand any of this. 10 minutes ago, I had been driving home from work thinking about leftover pasta in my refrigerator and whether I had enough coffee for the morning. Now I was standing outside an emergency room with a stranger who had somehow turned a simple act of helping into a puzzle I could not solve. "Look," I said gently, leaning closer to the open passenger door. "You can explain everything later. Right now you need to come inside." Adrian studied my face for a long second, his expression softening slightly in a way that made him look less like the mysterious man from Harbor Road and more like someone who had simply reached the edge of his strength. For a moment I thought he might finally agree. Then a pair of headlights swept across the far edge of the hospital parking lot. The light moved slowly between the rows of parked cars before turning down the street again. Adrian noticed it instantly. His posture changed again, that same alert focus returning to his eyes. "Ella," he said quietly. The way he said my name carried a warning that made my stomach tighten again. "Listen carefully." The nurse stepped forward slightly, still holding the wheelchair she had brought outside. "Sir, if you attempt to leave in your condition." Adrian lifted one hand weakly but firmly, stopping her sentence without raising his voice. "I am not leaving," he said calmly. Then he looked back at me. "But neither are you." I blinked in confusion. "What?" He took a slow breath, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Someone was following us earlier," he said. "The car on Harbor Road." I nodded slowly. Yes, but they kept driving. Adrian shook his head slightly. No, they watched. The mist drifted across the parking lot again, and the bright hospital lights suddenly felt too exposed, like we were standing on a stage instead of outside a place meant for safety. The nurse glanced toward the street behind us, uncertain. If someone was following you, you should definitely come inside where security is present, she said firmly. Adrian did not respond to her. His attention stayed on me. You helped me tonight, he said quietly. That means whoever was looking for me may also have seen you. The words settled heavily in the cool night air. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. You were saying that helping you might have made me part of whatever this is? I asked slowly. Adrian's eyes held mine with calm honesty. Yes, he said. The nurse looked between us again, now clearly realizing that this was not an ordinary accident case. Then the safest place for both of you is inside the hospital, she insisted. Adrian leaned back slightly against the seat, exhaustion creeping into his expression again, but his voice stayed steady when he answered. No, he said quietly. The safest place for her is far away from me. The words settled between us like the mist drifting across the hospital parking lot, quiet but heavy enough to change the way the entire night felt. For a moment, I simply stared at him, trying to decide whether I should laugh, argue, or walk away. Far away from you, I repeated slowly. You were the one who told me to stop the car earlier. Adrian watched me with the same steady expression he had used all night, calm but serious in a way that made it hard to dismiss what he was saying. The nurse shifted beside us, clearly caught between her training to help a patient and the strange tension that had filled the air since Adrian refused to enter the hospital. Sir, if you believe someone is following you, security can assist, she said carefully. Adrian shook his head again, slower this time. Security guards cannot stop the kind of people who were looking for me tonight. The nurse fell silent, clearly unsure how to respond to that. I folded my arms, the damp fabric of my jacket still cold against my skin. You keep saying things like that, I said quietly, but you have not actually explained anything. Adrian closed his eyes briefly as if gathering the strength to continue speaking. When he opened them again, the sharp focus had returned. Earlier tonight, he said, someone tried to make sure I would not make it home. His tone remained calm, but the meaning behind the words sent a chill through me. I remembered the wrecked car on Harbor Road, the smoke drifting through the rain, the way he had warned me I should have kept driving. And you think they might still be looking for you? I said. Adrian nodded once. Yes. I looked out across the parking lot again. The hospital lights stretched across rows of parked cars and empty pavement, quiet and ordinary. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. But the strange certainty in Adrian's voice made the place feel different somehow, like the calm surface of a lake hiding something deeper beneath it. Then why tell me to leave? I asked. If someone saw me help you, would that not make it worse if I drove away alone? Adrian studied me again, and for the first time there was something almost respectful in his expression. You are smarter than most people I meet, he said quietly. Which is exactly why you should not stay near me longer than necessary. I let out a small breath that might have been a laugh. That is a strange way to thank someone who dragged you out of a burning car. The nurse cleared her throat gently, still holding the wheelchair beside the passenger door. Regardless of whatever situation you two are discussing, she said, this man still needs medical attention. Adrian glanced at her briefly before looking back at me. She is right about one thing, he admitted. I do need help. I waited for him to finally agree to go inside the hospital. Instead, he surprised both of us again. But not here, he said. The nurse blinked in disbelief. Then where? She asked. Adrian leaned slightly forward in the seat, though the movement clearly cost him effort. His eyes stayed locked on mine as if he had already made a decision he was not planning to explain fully. Somewhere quiet, he said. Somewhere no one will be watching. I felt the strange weight of the moment return again. The same feeling that had started the second I stopped my car on Harbor Road. I should have walked away right then. I should have handed him over to the hospital staff and driven home like a normal person. Instead, I found myself asking the one question that would keep me involved in a night that was already far more complicated than it should have been. And how exactly are we supposed to find a place like that? Adrian's faint smile returned, small but certain. I was hoping, he said softly, you might know somewhere. For a moment, I just stared at him, trying to decide whether he was serious or simply delirious from whatever had happened before I found him on Harbor Road. The hospital lights buzzed softly above us, and the mist continued to drift across the parking lot like thin smoke, blurring the edges of the quiet night. "You cannot be serious," I said slowly. "You want me to take you somewhere else instead of the hospital?" Adrian did not look away. His pale green eyes held the same steady focus that had been there since the moment he warned me about the headlights behind us. "Just for a little while," he said quietly. "Long enough for me to recover and make a few calls." The nurse let out a small breath that clearly meant she had reached the end of her patience. "Sir," she said firmly, "you were just in a serious accident and you are refusing professional medical care. That is not something I can recommend." Adrian gave her a polite nod that somehow felt both respectful and final. "I understand," he replied calmly, "but I cannot stay here." I rubbed my forehead with my hand, feeling the exhaustion of the long night beginning to catch up with me. Everything about this situation felt completely unreasonable. A normal person would have stepped aside by now, handed the responsibility to hospital staff, and gone home. But nothing about Adrian Cross felt normal. I looked at him sitting in the passenger seat of my old Civic, his soaked suit pressed against the worn fabric, his posture still upright, even though he clearly had very little strength left. There was something stubborn in the way he carried himself, like a man who had spent his entire life refusing to let anyone else make decisions for him. "You realize I barely know you," I said quietly. Adrian nodded. "Yes. And you are asking me to drive you somewhere private in the middle of the night after telling me someone might be following you." He nodded again. "Also yes." I could not help letting out a tired laugh. "That is the worst pitch I have ever heard." The faint smile returned to his face, small but genuine. "It is the only one I have." The nurse shifted beside us, clearly unsure whether to insist again or walk back inside. "Miss Monroe," she said gently, "if he refuses treatment, there is only so much we can do. But I would strongly advise you not to involve yourself further in whatever situation this is." I looked toward the hospital doors behind her. Warm light spilled across the pavement, and through the glass I could see people moving through the lobby like any normal night in any normal hospital. A simple choice stood right in front of me. I could step inside, explain everything, and let the professionals handle it from there. Or I could get back into my car and keep driving into a situation I still did not understand. I looked back at Adrian. "You said somewhere quiet," I said slowly. "What exactly does that mean?" Adrian leaned his head back against the seat for a moment, as if even talking had begun to drain the last of his energy. "Just somewhere safe for a few hours," he said. "Somewhere not connected to me." I thought about that. My apartment was 15 minutes away, small and ordinary, and definitely not connected to anyone like him. The thought of bringing a mysterious stranger there should have sounded insane. Instead, it felt like the only place I could think of that fit his description. I let out a long breath and opened the driver's side door again. "Fine," I said quietly, "but only for a little while." Adrian looked at me, surprised but grateful in a way he did not say out loud. I turned to the nurse and offered an apologetic smile. "Thank you for trying to help," I said, "but I think we are going to handle this a different way." Then I climbed back into the driver's seat and started the engine once more, wondering how a quiet drive home had somehow turned into the most complicated night of my life. The engine of my Civic hummed softly as I pulled away from the hospital entrance, the bright lights fading in the rearview mirror while the quiet streets of the city stretched ahead of us again. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The windshield wipers swept slowly across the glass, pushing aside the last thin traces of mist while the road reflected the streetlights in long silver lines. I kept my speed steady at about 25 miles per hour, partly because the pavement was still slick and partly because my brain was still catching up with the decision I had just made. 10 minutes ago, I had been standing outside a hospital with a nurse offering help. Now I was driving a stranger away from that help toward my apartment. "You know this is probably a terrible idea," I said quietly without looking away from the road. Adrian let out a faint breath that almost sounded like a tired laugh. "Yes," he admitted. I glanced toward him briefly. His head rested against the window again, but his eyes were open, watching the passing streetlights with quiet awareness. "Then why are you so calm about it?" I asked. He considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because terrible ideas sometimes keep people alive," he said softly. I did not know how to respond to that, so I Let the silence settle between us again while the car moved through the quiet streets. The city looked different at this hour. Most of the storefronts were dark, and the few cars on the road moved slowly like they were trying not to disturb the stillness of the night. After a minute, Adrian shifted slightly in the seat, clearly trying to stay upright despite the exhaustion creeping back into his posture. "Where are we going?" he asked. "My apartment," I replied. "It is small and nothing special, but it is quiet and nobody there is going to recognize you." Adrian nodded slowly, accepting the answer without hesitation. "That is exactly what I need." I turned onto a narrower street lined with old brick buildings and parked cars, the kind of neighborhood that never made the news because nothing dramatic ever happened there. My building sat halfway down the block, a modest 3-story place with a flickering porch light and a small staircase leading up to the front door. I pulled into the curb and shifted the car into park. The engine fell silent, leaving only the distant sound of water dripping from rooftops after the storm. For a moment, neither of us moved. Adrian looked out the windshield at the quiet street, like he was memorizing every detail. "You do realize," he said slowly, "that letting me inside your home means trusting someone you barely know." I shrugged slightly. "You trusted me to pull you out of a burning car," I replied. "I guess that makes us even." The faint smile returned to his face again, though it was weaker this time. I stepped out of the car and walked around to the passenger side, opening the door carefully. Adrian tried to stand on his own, but quickly realized his strength was not fully back yet. Without saying anything, I slipped my arm under his shoulder to help steady him. He hesitated for a brief moment, clearly not used to needing help, then accepted it with quiet dignity. Together we walked slowly up the short staircase toward the front door of my building. The porch light buzzed overhead, and the quiet street behind us remained completely still. As I reached into my pocket for my keys, a strange thought crossed my mind. Just a few hours ago, Adrian Cross had been a stranger lying beside a broken car on Harbor Road. Now he was about to step into my life in a way neither of us could have predicted. I unlocked the door and pushed it open with my shoulder while still helping Adrian keep his balance. The narrow hallway of my building quiet and dim except for the soft yellow glow of an overhead bulb that flickered every few seconds. The place always smelled faintly like old wood and laundry detergent, the familiar scent strangely comforting after everything that had happened tonight. Adrian paused just inside the doorway, taking a slow breath like the simple act of standing upright had become harder with each step. "Second floor," I said gently, shifting his arm across my shoulders so he would not lose his balance. The staircase creaked under our weight as we climbed slowly, one careful step at a time. I had walked those steps hundreds of times without thinking about them, but tonight every sound felt louder than usual, echoing through the quiet building like we were announcing our arrival to the entire block. Halfway up the stairs, Adrian paused, steadying himself against the railing. "You live here alone?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Yes." His eyes moved slowly through the hallway like he was studying the space the same way he had studied the road earlier. "Good," he said softly. I glanced at him. That does not sound like a compliment. The corner of his mouth lifted faintly. It means fewer people are involved in something they did not ask for. We reached the second floor landing, and I guided him down the short hallway toward apartment 2B. The door looked exactly the same as it always did, slightly scuffed paint, and a small brass number plate that had been there longer than I had lived in the building. I unlocked it quickly and pushed the door open. Warm air greeted us immediately along with the faint scent of coffee from the pot I had forgotten to wash earlier that evening. My apartment was small but comfortable, a simple living room with a worn gray couch, a narrow kitchen along one wall, and a lamp glowing softly beside a bookshelf filled with paperbacks. Adrian stopped just inside the doorway and looked around with quiet curiosity, like he was stepping into a completely different world than the one he normally lived in. "You can sit down," I said, guiding him toward the couch. He lowered himself slowly onto the cushions, clearly trying not to show how much the effort cost him. Once he was seated, he leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. I disappeared into the kitchen and returned a minute later with a clean towel and a glass of water. "Drink this," I said, handing it to him. Adrian accepted the glass and took a slow sip, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly as the warmth of the apartment settled around him. I pulled a small first aid kit from the cabinet beneath the sink and sat down on the coffee table across from him. You are lucky I work in a clinic, I said, opening the kit. Otherwise this part would be much more complicated. Adrian watched me quietly while I soaked the towel with warm water and gently cleaned the dirt and rain from his hands. For the first time since I found him on Harbor Road, the intensity in his expression softened into something almost peaceful. You should not have done this, he said quietly after a moment. I looked up at him, surprised. Driven you here? Adrian shook his head slowly. Save me. I held his gaze for a second before returning to the first aid kit. Too late to change that now, I replied calmly. Outside the window the city remained quiet, the last traces of rain sliding down the glass, while the soft glow of streetlights filled the room with a calm that felt almost unreal after the chaos of the night. Adrian leaned back against the couch, watching me carefully like he was realizing something he had not expected. And in that quiet moment inside my small apartment, the distance between two completely different worlds felt smaller than either of us had planned. I finished wrapping the last strip of bandage around his hand and leaned back slightly on the coffee table, studying the results with the quiet satisfaction that came from doing something practical after such a strange night. Adrian watched every movement carefully, his pale green eyes following my hands with a calm focus that made the room feel unusually still. Outside the window the rain had finally stopped completely, leaving only the soft glow of streetlights reflecting off the damp pavement 2 stories below. The quiet in my apartment felt deeper than usual, like the world had slowed down just enough for both of us to breathe again. There, I said gently as I closed the first aid kit. Nothing professional, but it should help until you see an actual doctor. Adrian looked down at the bandage and flexed his fingers slightly, as if testing the movement. You say that like I still plan to visit one, he replied softly. I gave him a look that made it clear I had not forgotten that argument. Eventually you will, I said. Even stubborn people run out of excuses. That faint smile appeared again, the one that made him look less intimidating and more human than he probably intended. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The quiet stretched between us while the lamp beside the couch filled the room with warm yellow light. Adrian leaned his head back slightly against the cushions, clearly feeling the exhaustion of the night settling deeper now that the immediate tension had passed. You are very calm, he said after a moment. I raised an eyebrow. You say that like it surprises you. He studied me carefully before answering. Most people would have asked 100 questions by now. I shrugged lightly. I figured you would tell me what you want me to know eventually. Adrian looked down at the glass of water still resting in his hand. For the first time since I had found him on Harbor Road, he seemed to hesitate before speaking. My name really is Adrian Cross, he said quietly, and the people who were looking for me tonight were not strangers. I waited without interrupting. He noticed that and gave a small nod of appreciation before continuing. Sometimes the most dangerous problems come from people who used to stand beside you, he said. The way he phrased it made the meaning clear without needing details. I leaned back slightly, absorbing that. So tonight was not just an accident, I said slowly. Adrian shook his head. No. Silence returned again for a few seconds, but this time it felt heavier with understanding. I looked around my small living room, at the bookshelves and the quiet kitchen and the soft lamplight that had always made this place feel safe. It was strange realizing that someone like Adrian now sat in the middle of it. You said earlier that letting you inside meant trusting someone I barely know, I said thoughtfully. Adrian nodded. Yes. I folded my arms loosely. Then I guess that means you are trusting me too. Adrian considered that before answering. More than I usually trust anyone. His voice was calm but sincere in a way that made the room feel even quieter. For a moment we simply looked at each other across the small space. Two people from completely different worlds sharing the same quiet apartment after a night neither of us had planned. Outside a car passed slowly along the street, its headlights briefly illuminating the ceiling before fading away again. Adrian shifted slightly on the couch, his posture finally relaxing as the warmth of the apartment replaced the tension he had carried all night. You changed the outcome of tonight, he said quietly. I tilted my head. By pulling you out of that car? Adrian shook his head slowly. By stopping it all. The words hung in the air between us while the quiet apartment wrapped around the moment like a pause before something neither of us had expected. The quiet in my apartment lingered after Adrian's words, settling gently between the two of us like the calm that follows a storm. For a moment neither of us spoke. The soft glow of the lamp beside the couch painted warm shadows across the walls, and outside the window the city seemed to move slowly again, as if nothing unusual had happened tonight. I leaned back slightly in my chair and studied him more carefully than before. Earlier, he had looked like a man barely holding on through sheer determination. Now, with dry clothes and a place to rest, some of the sharp tension in his posture had faded. He still looked tired, but no longer like someone standing at the edge of collapse. Adrian noticed my gaze and tilted his head slightly. "What?" he asked quietly. I shrugged. "I was just thinking that you look less terrifying now that you are sitting on my couch with a bandage on your hand." A small laugh escaped him, low and genuine. It was the first real laugh I had heard from him all night. "I will try not to take that personally," he said. I reached for the empty glass on the coffee table and stood up, carrying it back to the kitchen sink. The simple act of rinsing a glass felt strangely grounding after everything that had happened. When I returned to the living room, Adrian was still watching the window, his expression thoughtful. "You said earlier that someone who used to stand beside you caused tonight?" I said carefully. Adrian nodded slowly. "Yes. Does that mean they might come looking again?" For a moment he did not answer. His eyes moved across the quiet room, taking in the bookshelf, the small kitchen, the worn couch beneath him. Finally he looked back at me. "Not tonight," he said. "They will believe their plan worked." I folded my arms loosely. "Because of the crash." Adrian nodded again. "Exactly." The idea sent a strange chill through me, but there was also a quiet relief hidden inside it. If the people who wanted Adrian gone believed he was already out of the picture, then this small apartment might actually be the safest place for him right now. Adrian shifted slightly, leaning forward to rest his elbows on his knees. The movement made him wince just a little before he hit it again. "Ella," he said softly. I looked up. "Yes." He studied me with that same steady focus that had been there since Harbor Road, but now it carried something else as well. Gratitude. Maybe even curiosity. "Tonight should have ended very differently," he said. I thought about the broken car, the empty road, the headlights that had followed us through the rain. "Probably," I agreed quietly. Adrian leaned back against the couch again, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since he stepped through my door. "Instead," he continued, "I ended up in the apartment of a woman who refused to leave me on the side of the road." I smiled slightly. "You say that like it is unbelievable." "It is," he replied calmly. Silence returned again, but this time it felt comfortable instead of tense. After a moment, Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small phone that I had not noticed before. He glanced at the screen briefly, then set it on the coffee table without unlocking it. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly, "my world will start moving again." I raised an eyebrow. "And tonight?" Adrian looked around the room once more, his gaze settling on me with quiet certainty. "Tonight," he said, "I owe my life to the woman who decided to stop her car." I shook my head slightly and reached over to turn down the lamp beside the couch, letting the room settle into a softer glow. "You can repay that by getting some rest," I said. Adrian closed his eyes for a moment, finally allowing the exhaustion of the night to take hold. And as the quiet apartment filled with the steady rhythm of the sleeping city outside, I realized something simple and unsettling at the same time. The moment I stopped my car on Harbor Road had not just changed his night. It had quietly changed mine as well.